Welcome everyone! In my previous endgame video, I showed two ways to draw a very common rook and pawn endgame. Of course, even with best play, it's not possible to draw every rook and pawn endgame. Some positions are just objectively lost. And some of those positions are so common that they've been worked out perfectly already many years ago. And that means it's easy for us to study them and learn exactly how to win. The most famous one is the one I'll show today. The position in front of you is the Lucena position. You can see white is a pawn up and the pawn is on the 7th rank already. However, right now the king is blocking his own pawn, and if black would be able to keep the king there, then white cannot win. Sadly for black though, white has a forced win. And keep in mind, white always wins his position except when it's a rook's pawn. Then it's not always possible. Now, let's begin. Black plays rook to c2. Now the white king cannot go to the c-file, and the black king is already keeping his enemy out of e6, e7 and e8. Therefore, white first of all gives this check. Now, whatever the black king does, the white king will get room to move away from d8. The worst square to go to would be e6, because after king to e8, you can see the rook cannot even give checks because his own king is in the way. Black can go rook to d2 to threaten the pawn, but after rook e1 check, the king is forced to leave the pawn and white promotes and wins. Slightly more resilient would be king to g7. Now there is room for the white king, but white still needs to solve something else. The king cannot try and promote the pawn right away, because black will check, and if then king to d6, check again, and after king to c6, another check. So if the king is near the pawn, he will always be checked. And of course, if the king would leave the pawn, then the rook targets the pawn again, so the pawn won't promote and white won't win. So going back here, white needs to prevent that his king gets endlessly checked, but there is a plan for this, and the first step is rook to f4. And the point is that the rook at some point will be able to shield the king from the checks, and after that, black cannot stop the pawn from queening. Now, how does that work in practice? Black cannot do a lot. Let's say he goes rook to c1. Now the king will come out. Black has to start checking again, otherwise the pawn queens. So rook e1 check, king d6, check again, king to e6. Of course the king hangs on to the pawn. But after rook e1 check, now it is possible for the king to step away from the pawn, because when black checks again, then finally the rook on f4 shields the king, and white now has two threats, rook takes rook and queening the pawn. Black cannot stop both, and after the rook saves itself, the pawn queens and white wins the game. Now, this isn't the only way to win this endgame, but is probably the easiest. Now, for completeness sake, let's go briefly back to this position. You may ask, after this check, what if the king doesn't go to g7 but to g6, planning to harass the rook when it gets to f4? That actually won't be a problem. White still goes rook to f4. And when the king starts harassing the rook, then the rook simply goes to d4. Now after king to f5, white again goes king to e7, threatening with d8 equals queen. And now white even wins faster, because similarly to before, after the check, the king is again shielded by black's king and white will promote next move. And if lastly, going back here, black doesn't go king to f5 but rook to e2, cutting off the king, that doesn't change anything because now the c-file is available, and after king to c8, black can again check, but now the king will hide on d6, and there's nothing black can do about that. So king to b7, check, king to c6, and another check. After king to d6, there are no checks left, and there's nothing that can stop white from queening next move. So that concludes the Lucena position. I hope everything was clear, but feel free to ask questions in the comment section if you'd like to. There is one final thing though I feel I should include as a final remark. If we look at this position, it looks similar to what we've just looked at, but there's one key difference. The black king is now on the short side of the pawn, and in this specific position, black's rook is on the long side on a2. That means that after this check, the black rook is now far enough from the white king that the king won't be able to approach the rook because then the pawn would hang. After king to d7 and this check, you can see that the king has to stay in touch with the pawn, and then the king will just be checked forever. Going back here after this check, when there's 3 squares between the rook and the pawn, then the king is too far away to attack the rook without giving up the pawn, so in that case it's gonna be a draw. If we quickly compare this to this position, when black checks here, you can see there's only 2 squares between the rook and the pawn, and after king to c7, the check, king to c8, another check, and king to b7, the king is close enough to attack the rook, and after rook to d8 and king to c7, the king is able to kick the rook away from d8 and white will promote the pawn and win the game. Now, for completeness sake, I felt I should include this. So when you try to reach the Lucena position, you must always be careful to not allow your opponent the opportunity to give checks on the long side of the pawn, because when that happens and your rook also isn't on the long side to block out the enemy rook, then you cannot win anyway. Anyway, I hope this was useful to you. If it was, please like the video and consider subscribing to the channel. I'd really appreciate it. More videos are coming up shortly. I'll see you guys again soon, and take care.